Hi, I'm Deboki and this is Okie Dokie Boki, and today I'm going to be doing my wrap-up for the Booktube prize for the nonfiction semifinal. I was in Group B, so the books that I had to read were An Immense World by Ed Young, Under the Skin by Linda Villarosa, Stranger to Ourselves by Rachel Aviv, The Escape Artist by Jonathan Friedland, Sandy Hook by Elizabeth Williamson, and His Name is George Floyd by Toulouse Olorunipa and Robert Samuels. Overall, before I get into the specifics of how I ranked these books and how I responded to them, I will say that I feel like a recurring theme this year for me with the Booktube prize is that I feel like I've mostly pretty much enjoyed all of the books I've read. Not even mostly, I've actually enjoyed all of the books I've read. Usually with the Booktube prize, I will find that there are a few books that I really respond negatively to, and that just hasn't really happened this year. I just don't have as polarizing of responses to the books I've been reading. I don't know why. It might just be that the nonfiction books this year are really good, or it might just be that I am in a weirdly more mellow place with my responses. It might be a mixture, it might just be luck, whatever. I don't know what it is. It is both really exciting because it is nice to read a bunch of books that you don't hate. It also makes judging really difficult for me. I have had a really hard time with figuring out my rankings because honestly, I feel like with all of these books, I have been in a place of feeling okay with whichever ones make it through. There are ones that I am a little more pro, but I can see why other ones might beat them, and I'm mostly pretty okay with that. But that's just a minor inconvenience. Overall, I think the fact that I'm getting to mostly read books that I enjoy is winning out. That is a satisfying thing. That is a good thing, especially with how much time it takes to read for the Booktube prize. I'm glad. A lot of the times my ranking, as we'll see going forward, is more about what I prefer in nonfiction, in a very broad sense, rather than necessarily specific things that I think these books are doing wrong. It's just about a general preference for certain types of nonfiction over others. And that feels kind of annoying to hold against a book. I think if a book has chosen a particular way to function, if it has chosen a certain type of thing to be and it does that pretty well, I feel kind of bad being yeah, well, I just don't like what you want to be. I mean, I guess it's okay. But if I'm not morally opposed to it existing in that way, it feels a little mean to just be well, you're not that other book. What can I say? But I don't know, I guess that's what judging is. It's just being yeah, you're not that other book. So I'm gonna move with my rankings from the ones that I ranked at the bottom and move my way up to the top. And I'm actually gonna start with my bottom two books because these are the two books that are the most, basically what I was just saying, where it is, they are a type of book that I just don't really respond to as well as other types of books. So these are His Name is George Floyd, One Man's Life and the Struggle for Racial Justice, and the other is Sandy Hook, An American Tragedy. His Name is George Floyd is mostly a biography of George Floyd, but it's really using his life as sort of a centerpiece to explore how racism works in America through the conditions that his family and him have had to deal with in Houston, and then when he moved to Minnesota, what are the ways that racism has had very specific effects on the communities around him, but then also, of course, his death and how that shaped the protests going forward. And then Sandy Hook is about Sandy Hook, the shooting, but mostly it's really about the families of the victims of Sandy Hook who have had to subsequently deal with all of these conspiracy theories that claim that, the shooting didn't happen, it was staged and all of this stuff. And of course, at the center of all that conspiracy theory, and so kind of the central villain of this book as well, is Alex Jones. Okay, so like I said, I am grouping these two books together at this bottom of my ranking and also my thoughts, because basically most of what I'm going to say about one is what I would want to say about the other. And it's really that I didn't dislike either of these books. I think they were both pretty strong in a lot of the things they were doing. It's more that these books are a type of book that I have a harder time with. I would basically classify these books under whatever term describes books that are about relatively recent traumatic events where the story at the center of them is either very fresh or still unfolding in a lot of ways. And so that means that both of these books have this challenge where once the book kind of starts to catch up with the present, like, you know, we start in the past, we start in George Floyd's early days, we start in the Sandy Hook shooting, and that has, like, time has passed since then. So there's a lot to, like, look at there, and especially as we're, like, looking at how, say, like, the conspiracy theories start to unfold, there was a lot to learn and process there. And so, like, the beginning of these books for me are very strong, but as you start to catch up to the present day, which is where a lot of really climatic things happen, there's just not a lot of space to kind of process and analyze, because we as, like, a collective society are still processing and analyzing. So the books themselves don't necessarily have the space to fully digest what it is they are showing is happening at such an important stage in the story and in the books. On a quick side note, because I was thinking about this when I was thinking about why this type of book doesn't really work for me, there's a related subgenre of book that is basically the books that are about a big, bad, recent business thing. And the one that I'm thinking of most is Bad Blood by John Carreyrou, which was about Theranos. It came out, like, before Elizabeth Holmes's trial even, I think, or maybe, like, the trial dates were set, but, like, really it came out at a time where, like, Theranos had been exposed, but we, like, did not know where that story was gonna go. And so, like, there's a way in which that book feels very similar to kind of what these books are doing, in that they are about a recent thing that is in the news, about from a journalist who's, like, really talking about it in a journalisty kind of way. But these kind of, like, big bad recent business book kind of things are, for some reason, less frustrating in this way. I think it's because, like, mostly I just want to see the big bad business thing fall apart. And so there's, like, an actual arc to them that you can follow and you can get to the end. And so even if things are, like, still unfolding and still kind of, like, happening, it doesn't feel quite as, like, thin at the end. Thin is not the right word, but, like, it doesn't feel quite as, like, unresolved at the end compared to these other types of books where the events at the center of them are something, I don't know, much more existential and, like, much more violent. I do think you could actually do a version of Sandy Hook that is that kind of big bad business book, except it would be a book about InfoWars and Alex Jones. And, like, I think there actually is a way that that book could work in the way that, like, Bad Blood works, but that would actually be a completely different book than what I think Williamson was interested in writing, which is a book about the families and how they are contending with this horrible thing that has happened to them, both, like, in the past and also in this ongoing conspiracy theory, like, minded world that, like, they've been forced in. And what is interesting to me is that Sandy Hook is the book that I ranked the lowest of all of my readings for this round, but it's also the book that has, I think, some of the most details that I'm going to be remembering and thinking about going forward. And I think part of that is just because it is, like, viscerally so emotional. Like, there is just so much packed into it that you're, like, turning page after page and hearing about, like, the horrible things that people have said about these families and the ways that they've had to confront that head on, but also you're reading about, like, these specific strategies that the families took to, like, deal with that. And that is really interesting. Like, it is, like, just when you, like, in a broader sense, I think this book is so interested in misinformation and conspiracy theories, and, like, I think that is an existential crisis for all of us, like, even beyond Sandy Hook. And so, like, reading the specific instances of, say, like, a volunteer network that learned how to weaponize copyright strikes against InfoWars, that was really meaningful, both in the context of the story and just, like, how I think about misinformation and conspiracy theories on the internet more broadly. But I ended up ranking it below His Name is George Floyd, mostly because I felt like His Name is George Floyd had this clear structure of how it was using George Floyd's life at the center of it all to kind of figure out what other aspects of racism in America, like, it was going to explore and how it was going to explore it. And I just thought that that structure was really clearly done, and I thought the analysis kind of related to that was also just really, really well thought out. And the problem for me with Sandy Hook was that ultimately I had a really hard time getting a grasp of its structure. I had a hard time understanding why things were laid out the way that they were. Like, I just couldn't feel like I just felt like I could never get a full grasp on what it was doing, even though I kind of understood the overall purpose. Just the way that those choices with like specific things in terms of chapters and sentences, like they just never felt like they fully connected. And I think that might partly be because I read it in print. And so there were just a lot of times where there were these like short 1-sentence paragraphs, and I would end up getting really distracted by them and trying to figure out like why they were like 1 sentence, like what was the point of like keeping them in their own paragraph. And it just made for this like overall very choppy reading experience. And it actually felt a lot like reading a newspaper article, which is like fine when you're reading a newspaper article, but it's harder if you're reading a book. But overall, like those specific choice issues are like not really that big of a deal. My problem more fundamentally is like with what these types of books are, and the fact that there are a type of book that I have a harder time reading. So I don't think that they are bad books. I think they are books that are just written in a way that like I ultimately have a harder time with given what I'm looking for in a nonfiction book. So I think if they're appealing to you, and I think if that's a type of book that you respond to, these are both like perfectly good examples of them, and they're worth checking out. So next up is number 4, The Escape Artist, the man who broke out of Auschwitz to warn the world. I actually read this book in the previous group, and it like killed me to put it number 4 here because I read it in the previous group and loved it. And it's really just because I ended up loving so many of the books that were in this group and wanted to like kind of rank them just as my top 3. That's the only reason this is here. It was so hard to put it here. So The Escape Artist is about Rudolf Verba, who was one of the first Jews to escape from Auschwitz at a time when the deadliness of Auschwitz just wasn't fully known. And so his goal was to be able to like basically tell the world. I listened to this book on audiobook. Jonathan Friedland narrated it, and it was great. Highly recommend if you're looking for an audiobook to listen to. I think he just overall, this book did such a great job of constructing this narrative that is engrossing and fast moving, but it also manages to weave in a lot of information about Verba, about Europe in the 1940s, and also the mechanics of how Auschwitz worked. And I think that is like a particularly weird challenge for this book, which is that we like in the present day, we know what Auschwitz was, and like it's so ingrained, at least for me, this image of it as being this place that is terrible. And it's hard to imagine a world where like you don't know what Auschwitz is, right? Like it feels like to not know what Auschwitz is to live in a world where Auschwitz like didn't exist. But the whole point of this book is to really, or at least like a good section of it, is to convey that for the Nazis, the whole point was to hide what concentration camps were, so that not just so that like people didn't know you were doing this bad thing, like you knew, so like people wouldn't criticize you for it or whatever, but also because that was like an active tool in getting people to go to the concentration camp. So I think what Friedland does really well is convey the facade that like Auschwitz and other concentration camps were maintaining at that time so that they could exist, and so that millions of Jewish people across Europe could get sent to them under pretenses that are already horrible, but that like they still wouldn't necessarily know just like how much more horrible it would be. And like the fact that this ignorance was like essential to Nazis and their entire plan. And so reading this book, I mean, it's interesting talking about this after having just talked about the Sandy Hook book, because I think like what this book made me really think about so much was like the importance of information. And it's something like that I was thinking about, I mean, it's something I think about a lot in a lot of different contexts, but like I was on the Rise of Anti-Intellectualism panel at BookNet Fest, and like this book made me think a lot of things that were related to that, just like the way that information and the control of information is like so central to a lot of things that are going on right now in terms of like book bans and like trying to control university curriculums and like so much more. And so there is a way that this book is like both, you know, telling the story of this past, but also conveying all of these ideas that are so resonant today. And I just, and it's all through the lens of Verbo, who's this fascinating character, and just watching like the way that he operates in this concentration camp through this narrative. It's fascinating. He's like super intelligent and restless and crafty. And I think Friedland does a really good job of like portraying the way that he just, I don't know, just like he felt like such a real person. I mean, obviously he is a real person, but like it just felt so vivid, the kind of character he was. He's also ultimately, Verba is not a character who is entirely sympathetic. And I think one of the things that Friedland does that's very smart is not shy away from the parts of him that are not sympathetic, because it just makes the book feel so much more human, so that, you know, it is the story, it is the ideas, and just everything really comes together really well. Now that I'm talking about it, I'm like, why did I put it as fourth? It was so good. But yeah, it's just because I also loved a lot of the books I'm about to talk about. So next up is Under the Skin, The Hidden Toll of Racism on American Lives and on the Health of Our Nation. And this book is based in part on an article that Linda Villarosa, the author, published in the New York Times Magazine about the rates of maternal mortality and infant mortality in America for Black women. But it also draws a lot on Villarosa's background as a journalist to trace like our stories about health, and particularly like the health of Black people, that have informed the ways that racism works in America. So expanding beyond maternal mortality into mental health and like other areas of health as well. I really appreciated this book, and I think it was most effective when Villarosa was drawing on personal stories and using that to kind of frame out a lot of the ideas that she's exploring in terms of health and racism in America. One of my favorite parts of this book is the way that Villarosa situates herself in it, and particularly her past experience as a former health editor at Essence. She talks about that experience early on, like in the introduction, and it's something that clearly has like shaped a lot of the analysis that she's done. Like there's clearly a way in which her reflecting on the past ways that she wrote about health for Essence has like continued to inform the way that she thinks about it today, often through like the fact that she has shifted away from things that she used to write before. And I think that's just a really fascinating journey for herself as a writer. And I liked the way that that played out in the book, kind of like through multiple chapters. And even though it's like very personal to her, I think it's also an important part of the book overall, because it's really about the way that like our approach to medicine and wellness has shifted over time. And that's something that she's not just had a front row seat to, it's something that she's actually been involved in shaping. So it's personal, but it's also kind of connected to this broader message in the book that isn't just about medicine, it's about the way that we think about medicine, and also how the way that we think about medicine affects the way that medicine actually gets practiced and affects the way that people's lives actually get to be lived. This book actually made me think a lot about another book that I read this year for the Booktube Prize. It was for the fiction one. I read it in the beginning of the year, and it was called Take My Hand. And that was a fictionalized take on the very real stories of Mary Alice and Minnie Lee Ralph, who were 12 and 14 when they were sterilized without consent in 1973. And I had mixed feelings about that book. I thought like the central story of it was very important. Like I think it's really like taking on an important cause and like what it's trying to do through fiction. But ultimately my biggest problem with it was the fact that it was fiction. I felt like ultimately the fiction writing didn't really fully justify the point of making it fiction. I would have almost really rather read the nonfiction research that it, like the author had clearly done a lot of. And I would have preferred the nonfiction version of that story. And that ended up being a feeling I revisited with Under the Skin, because it actually covered the nonfiction version of that story. Like it covered the actual historical events that inspired Take My Hand. And I ended up finding that so much more effective, even over only a few pages. And it also kind of revealed to me that some of the changes that were made in Take My Hand were changes that made the story less compelling than the actual history. So overall, I think Villarosa did a great job of documenting both like kind of past and present stories with healthcare, and also in summarizing research. The one thing that's always going to be a little bit kind of unsatisfying for me with a book like this one is that the analysis is driven by data and research. And so like there is like a sense of there being quantitative data underlying all of this, but we don't really get to see that data that often. I don't think there are any like graphs or charts in this book from what I remember, and the times that numbers are referenced are like not as often as I would personally prefer for a book like this. And I don't know if that's unfair, because I don't think this book is striving to be very academic. Like, I don't think it's trying to be a rigorous, like, quantitative argument, but it is still relying on those kinds of arguments. So ultimately, for me, that's just always going to be something limiting about how, I don't know, how concretely I can use this book to kind of draw broader conclusions. Because if I'm reading a sentence that's making a claim, but I don't get to like really engage fully with the data underlying it, that has to be compensated for in other ways that for this book I didn't necessarily always find. But overall, I think it is a good and pretty succinct overview of how racism permeates healthcare in America. Next up is Stranger to Ourselves, Unsettled Minds and the Stories That Make Us. I don't feel like I can do a summary of this book that feels really adequate. Essentially, it is an exploration through several case studies of like the stories we tell about mental health to ourselves, kind of like in the title. Aviv uses specific stories of people dealing with different mental health issues to explore broader questions about the way that culture informs mental health, and also the way that we process stories of mental health related to ourselves and to other people, and also, of course, like medical treatments for mental health issues as well. I say that it's hard to come up with a summary that feels adequate for this book, because when I read the actual summary of this book, it also doesn't feel adequate. And like, this is the summary meant to like sell the book, and I think it is accurate, and yet it is also not able to fully capture like what the book is. And I don't hold that against the summary writer, because I also don't really feel like I fully understand how to capture what the book is. That's partly because I feel like any summary starts to just feel like a list of different case studies that Aviv is pursuing in the book, but that like treats the case studies as if they are like their own individual thing, like they are just like little segments of the book, and that doesn't really fully adequately convey what the book is doing with these case studies either. Because really, what is so impressive to me about this book and why it is in my top 3 is that I just really thought the book did a great job of using these case studies to not just like tell a specific story, but also to build on each other. There's only like a few of these like case studies in this book, and I think that's ultimately a really, really smart choice, because it allows Aviv to talk about specific experiences and their cultural context in depth without having to draw any large conclusions that I think just like aren't in the scope of this book to begin with. And she gets to take a lot of care with each individual story. And so when things get thorny in terms of how she wants to analyze them or think about the culture that informs them, I think she also has the space to let them be thorny, because she doesn't have to move on to some other story. She can actually kind of let that like difficulty breathe and sit there, so that you as the reader are also kind of thinking through what you do or do not agree with in terms of how she's thinking through things or how she's explaining things. I just think that there's a good amount of space in this book. And so that is about the specific chapters themselves and how she handles them, but it's also about the overall structure that she creates throughout this book as she's going from one story to the next, and how Aviv chooses to order them and lets this arc built out within the stories themselves, and also the way that the thinking in one will kind of affect the way that you think about the next, and how that will also then like affect the way that you've read things previously. Like, it's just complicated, but it plays out in this way through the structure that is like kind of like elegant. I didn't come away from this book with like ideas. I came away from this book with questions, and I'm like still mulling over them, and I just really, really appreciated that experience. And I guess like I will like end this with a quote that I think actually maybe best explains what this book is, and it comes from Aviv herself. I was listening to an interview that she did with the Long Form podcast, and there was this moment where she was talking about the book's structure where I was like, yes, this is the thing that you have done that I really, really liked, and I needed you to explain it to me. And that's not something I always like doing. Like, I don't always want an author to explain their work for me, but this just like so perfectly encapsulated it. So what Aviv said in the long form podcast is one of the things I liked about writing a book is that to be aware of the fact that each story wasn't building on the next, in the sense that you were coming with a stronger and stronger argument, but actually each story was sort of complicating or challenging the ideas in the previous one. And yeah, that is like what it is, because I remember I would like come to the end of a chapter and be like, oh, okay, I feel like I got what I wanted to like get from this chapter. I kind of thought about mental health in this specific context and like thought about it in a different way. But then like I got to the next end of the next one and I was like, wait, so I have thoughts about this chapter, but also this chapter like changes the way that I think about the previous chapter before that. And so I just thought that was great, and I think she summed it up perfectly. And last, but definitely not least, because basically this means that this was my #1 book, we have An Immense World: How Animal Senses Reveal the Hidden Realms Around Us. This book is about how animals sense the environment around them, sometimes through senses we're familiar with, like smell or taste or touch, but also sometimes through senses that we might not relate to as much, like, you know, being able to detect electricity and magnetism. But more broadly, it's about how understanding the way that animals sense things gives us insight into what the experiences of the world is to them and how that shapes their interactions with it. The biggest compliment I can give this book is that I regret not reading it before this round. I think like I am on the record on this channel going back years at this point of being an Ed Yong fangirl. I read his writing a lot while I was in grad school. It's a big part of my why I want to be a science writer origin story. I just always liked the way that he writes things. I like the way that he references culture and how he relates them to science. I like the way that he portrays science getting done, the way that he portrays scientists as like these very human people and not just like these like super geniuses or whatever. Like I just always have really, really enjoyed his writing. So you might be wondering, Deboki, if you like his writing so much, why did you not read An Immense World last year when it came out? And that is because I am full of hubris. And when I heard what this book was about, I was like, I don't know. I don't really know if I need to read a lot about animal senses and behaviors. Like I do that for work already. I don't know like if this book is really gonna do that much new stuff for me. Like I had other things to read, so I was like, I'll get to it one day. But turns out I was wrong. There was a lot for me to get from this book. I loved it. The second biggest compliment I can give to this book, other than like having wished I had read it before this round, is that I like got halfway through and I was like dying to like tell somebody about how good it is. And like for the Booktube prize, we're not supposed to be like posting publicly about the books we're reading until like the end of the judging round. But I got to like halfway and I was like, I need to tell people to read this. So I texted one of my non-Booktube friends who I'm like always exchanging book recs with, and I was like, I've got a book for you, buddy. You're gonna like this one. And she sure does. Here's the thing. Like I said, I have been reading Ed Yong's writing for a while, and so I know that it's good. I know a lot of the ways that it is good to me. I know why I like his writing for the most part. But this book made me appreciate something that like I knew but like didn't fully appreciate, which is that he is very good at metaphor. Metaphor is like a big part of how we talk about nature, right? It's like part of poetry and music and all that, but it's also really, really useful for science writing. It's a big part of how we convey complicated concepts about the world. We use metaphor, we use simile, we use these comparisons to things that are, you know, much more relatable to be able to convey things that feel like 5 steps away from relatable. You know, like in art, we're using metaphor to make abstract feelings feel more tangible. In science writing, we're using abstract concepts of like physics or like sensory experiences feel more tangible. So yeah, in science writing, metaphors are a really powerful way to explain concepts, but they can also become excessive or distracting or like worst of all, I think, condescending. Like they can make the audience feel like you are talking down to them, that you have to like dumb things down or something like that. But this is a book that like by its very nature is reliant on metaphor. We are trying to understand how other animals process the world around them through senses that work maybe somewhat similarly or not at all similarly. Like they are conceiving of the world differently than us. And so we have to be able to have metaphor to bridge the gap between what it is that they're processing and how we process things, and like use metaphor as a way to somehow connect those two together. And so I was just constantly impressed throughout this book about how well these metaphors were articulated and how much they did to actually help me really like conceptualize these ideas of these different sensory experiences. Another thing, I've had this experience now where like I'm talking to other science writers and our conversations basically will just like turn into animal trivia contests, like informal ones. We're not really trying to one up with each other. It's really just like we're excited to share the weird facts that we know. And so like I feel like sometimes that like it's fun, but it also means that sometimes when you're doing science writing, your writing can easily turn into just like a list of like, oh my God, this is a cool fact. Like, oh my God, another cool fact. Oh my God, another cool fact. And like, it is very easy for this kind of book to just feel like a list of cool facts. Here's the thing, this book is a list of cool facts, and I really learned a lot from all of these cool facts. But I think what is really important about this list of cool facts is that Yang isn't just like showing off about how many weird random animal trivia facts that he knows. He is actually conceiving of like a central through line through all of them. It's not just cool facts for the sake of cool facts. It's cool facts for the sake of like explaining how cool and weird and complicated our world is. And so like this was like part of why I had to like tell my friend to read it, because I was just reading it and I was like overwhelmed by all of the cool new things I was learning. And so I was telling my friend like, you gotta read this, you're gonna find this amazing. And so I've been really excited because she'll like text me updates about like the weird new cool things she learned. So I'm really happy. Also, I listened to this book on audiobook as well, and also highly recommend it. So it was The Escape Artist and this one that I listened to on audiobook, and I thought they were both great. Ed Yong did the narration himself, also did a great job. So this was a great round for authors narrating their own audiobooks. That is my wrap up for the Booktube Prize. If you guys have read these books, let me know what you think. Also, while I'm here, I'm just gonna throw it out there. I've been starting to update my newsletter again. I'm trying to get better about like writing for it and like posting updates about things that I've been doing for work there. So if you ever want to be like updated on the things I'm thinking about reality TV or the science content that I have been working on, I'll leave a link to the newsletter down below. It's just okidokiboki.substack.com. So yeah, subscribe to that if you're interested. And yeah, that's my video. That is my Booktube Prize semifinal round. I'm excited to read the finals and get back to you guys in a few months with all of those thoughts. So thanks you guys for watching, and bye.